All right, welcome everybody. My name's Chris Harris. I am the director of the Esther B. Clark School. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's that wing over here on the other side. It's a non-public school where we work with kids with pretty severe mental health challenges and obviously maladaptive behaviors. We are 100% district referral, so we have two campuses here and one in San Jose. And we're working with a total of 70 different districts, from Marin County all the way down to San Benito County. And the kids we work with actually have a lot of scholastic potential, but they are so emotionally dysregulated that they've been unable to derive educational benefit in their in-district programs. And so the districts call on us to, as we run an integrated positive behavior and therapeutic milieu, which combines together to help these kids actually learn what you're going to learn about self-advocacy, because we do what we do with our kids is exactly what I'm going to be talking to you about today. The idea that you can just do self-advocacy skills is a myth, and so I'm going to take you through the prerequisite parts until we can get to self-advocacy skills, and we'll go over that in just a second. How many of you have been to a CHC presentation before? Okay. All right, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time because this is on your slides. You can always go to any presentation that's done, both parent and professional resources, by going to Community Connections, and also there's a chc.org resource library, which is available to anyone at all times. We talk about a variety of different issues, primarily based around kids with these kinds of issues. This is where CHC actually focuses its professional expertise on ADHD, learning differences, anxiety and depression, and autism. To do that, we have 4 different divisions here. We have an outpatient clinical services division, a private pay here, as well as a Medi-Cal clinic, and in the South Bay we have a Medi-Cal clinic. The Community Connections is actually what I'm representing today instead of the school. Well, this is the outreach that we do to support professionals and do lots of parent education and workshops. Sand Hill School is across the street, and if you ran into a bunch of kids coming out from play practice, that's them. That school works, is a private pay tuition, independent school, working with kids with learning disabilities, primarily dyslexia with ADHD. And then there's my school, the Esther B. Clark School, and we're working with kids, like I said, who are eligible under emotional disturbance or other health impaired, but are scholastically actually capable of accessing grade level curriculum, but are not doing so because of their emotional dysregulation. So we serve everybody without any discrimination. On your seats, you'll see something about EdRev Expo. This is a large event that we sponsor up at what is now Oracle Park, used to be AT&T. It's a celebration day for youngsters with learning differences and attention issues and anxiety and depression, and it's an opportunity for parents to get some education or learn a little bit more, and a chance for kids to get out in the field and play around and do all kinds of stuff and getting batting cages, and it's just a really fun day. And it's free of charge. So we have a fun day up there, and you'll see on your seats the Educator Friday, and we are setting up 3 teacher or professional workshops on Friday, May 3rd, that deal, one with executive functioning, one with behavior management, positive behavior management strategies, and another with assistive technology. So, and there's access numbers. You can easily find out more about them. And I think there should be a contact number and a person, Michelle White, who's actually organizing that whole program. All right. So we're going to dive in. And like I said, like I started, we can't start with self-advocacy. Actually, self-advocacy is the end point. There are lots of prerequisite steps that we need to take in order for kids to be competent and effective self-advocates, and I'm going to take you through that this afternoon. And you'll see what it looks like when kids actually are able to do it and the skills that they have developed. These are skills that you as teachers are certainly going to be able to apply in your classrooms. And then we're going to do some activities that will help facilitate and help you understand a little bit what each step towards self-advocacy is. So in a nutshell, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to start at 12 o'clock. Youngsters who do not have a realistic perception of their strengths and weaknesses, who are not self-aware, can't possibly move to self-advocacy because they won't know what to ask for and they won't actually know what they can do and what they can't do. So that is step number one. And then we're going to go right around clockwise until we get to self-advocacy. So these are basically the 5 prerequisite steps that we take with our kids before we actually get them to a level of self-advocacy. We at Esther B. Clark School, every kid's obviously on an IEP, and we seek to have our youngsters from 8th grade on, who are second, or at least second year with us, begin to take more and more participation in their IEPs until they get to actually transitioning out. And our goal is to have the youngsters actually almost lead that last IEP so that they're stating what they're going to need in order to be successful in the less restrictive environment. So they have participated and been taught and practiced the skills that we're going to be looking at this afternoon in order to get to that stage. All right, so let's start with self-awareness. And this involves, of course, learning and possessing an accurate perception of their strengths, interests, and aptitudes. And I can tell you, how many are all of you, and how many are gen ed teachers? No? All special, gen ed and special ed? Okay, so the kids that we are working with at the severity level are really youngsters who have identified themselves as being poor students and not worthy, and actually it's very hard for them to identify strengths, interests, and aptitudes and aspirations because nobody's ever recognized them for them. And because they've been in special education, they do not see themselves as worthwhile students or worthy students. And so one of the huge things in self-awareness is to have these youngsters actually identify their strengths, their interests, their aptitudes, and their character attributes. So we practice that, and one of the ways we practice that is every day a youngster at the end of the day has to identify an accomplishment and a challenge that they've overcome. So they have to acknowledge, I mean, all of our kids know that they have challenges, but it's working on those challenges and seeing themselves succeed as well as articulating an accomplishment. Now, if you get youngsters who have low self-esteem to be able to begin to do that, and you have 180 days of school, they're saying 180 times at least something that's worthwhile about them. And that begins, and what we want to do is to change their perception of themselves from negative to more objective and realistic. Okay? So we want them to have a vision and a motivation to become competent, relational, and autonomous. So we need to help them see their competencies, their abilities to be relational, which they all have, and their abilities to be autonomous, meaning that they can do lots for themselves, and then learn to understand when and where and to whom they go to when they need support or assistance, instead of just engaging in avoidant or negative attention-seeking behaviors. And then we also want them to understand, or more realistically understand, that the intent of people like yourselves towards them is actually one of support and corrective feedback, or supportive feedback, not of one of criticism of themselves as a person, but corrective feedback in terms of their performance as a student or a behavior that they're exhibiting. So eventually what we want to work on is to have students having an I can perception of themselves instead of an I can't and therefore I won't. Now, most of the time, when we have kids who are saying I won't, underneath that, just so you know, is usually an I can't, and I'm too embarrassed, or I'm too reluctant or too defended in order to let you know that I can't do that. So we go all the time when kids, well, I'm not going to do that, we assume that there's a can't component in there, and we're reshaping the way they look at themselves and saying, I know how to ask for support and get it and be able to work through that challenge instead of around it. All right, so in self-awareness, When we start with the kids, at first they're going to do it after the fact. They're going to be able to reflect and develop some objectivity about what they were able to accomplish after an episode, after a problem that they may have had. And we're looking for kids to, in developing higher self-awareness, what was their role? To start hearing and using the words, the pronoun I. Like, I had a role in that. I know what I could have done. I know an option that I could have taken that wouldn't have ended up in a negative outcome for me. It's always after the fact first, but that's the first sign that youngsters, A, are willing to become vulnerable and become actually empowered to say, I can control my environment better. And number two, it is they have begun to problem solve. Once they've gotten their emotions down, they're able to say, I had an option, I could have chosen to do option B instead of A. Then we move kids towards self-managing or self-regulating in the moment. Okay, so they're able to do it when they're becoming dysregulated in the moment. They are able to correct themselves in that moment and go on and interrupt their negative thoughts or their negative actions and be able to turn that around. And the best way, or the ideal level, is for the kids to become proactive and be able to anticipate situations, people or tasks that they're going to be challenged by, and be able to figure out a strategy of how they're going to be able to manage through that particular challenge. We seldom keep our kids long enough because if they're doing it in the moment, the districts want them back. But the best level of self-awareness is for them to be able to anticipate what's going to happen in the future and plan how they're going to manage through that activity. All right, so now you're going to get to know each other a little bit. What I want you to do is you're going to do what we do with our kids, and that is I want you to identify in yourselves six strengths, aptitudes, and special attributes and special aptitudes. Identify 2 or 3 challenges that you're experiencing, and articulate maybe how you've worked through some of those. So if you would just take a few minutes and fill in that chart for you, that would be terrific. All right? You can do it on any piece of scratch paper, but I want you to identify your aptitude strengths, your attributes assets, one thing you really like about yourself. Yep.
What's the difference between aptitude and attribute?
So aptitude is an intellectual strength. An attribute is a character strength that you have, okay? Like your personality or. So identify those strengths. So you're all lucky you're on in my San Jose class, because what I actually ask my students to do is they have to identify 10 strengths. And they struggle like crazy because they haven't been extrinsically validated in that many areas. And if you're not first extrinsically validated, it's pretty hard to internally or intrinsically develop your worthiness and your attributes and your aptitudes. So this is something that we work on, and you folks, I'm going to assume, have pretty intact self-esteems, but this becomes pretty hard. There's a discomfort actually about identifying one's strengths and attributes and aptitudes, but it is a key prerequisite to being able to self-advocate. Because in order to effectively self-advocate, you actually have to know what your strengths are and use them to facilitate your opportunities to self-advocate. It's easy. They will give you a list of things that they don't think they can do well, but starting with strength-based areas is very important for these kids, for them to internalize the sense that their self-awareness is actually objective and realistic and not all negative. So that's prerequisite number one. I also ask my students that, like, how do you know? How do you show what your attributes are? How do you do that? How do you actually express that so other people know you actually have that attribute or that aptitude? And they even struggle more than that after identifying the attribute. How do you show it? And lots of them don't even realize how they end up showing it. So on the last one is the strategies that accentuate or mitigate it. And so when you are thinking about yourself as somebody who people are attracted to, Like, what are the strategies that you actually use to have people be attracted to you? And these are things that we don't think about all the time. But you have adopted strategies that accentuate your strengths and can mitigate the challenges that you face, and that's why you're successful adults. But we don't actually obviously think about that very often because we can just kind of roll. But with the kids we are working with, they are so disproportionately negative that unless we can rebalance them to a more positive perception of themselves, they're really going to struggle in terms of understanding, like, how do you show the good the positive attributes and the aptitudes that you actually possess. So this is actually one of them. This is the most difficult activity I'll give you all afternoon. Okay, so don't worry, and I'm not going to quiz you at the end either. All right, so let's move to stage 2, which is self-regulation. And that's when, and you're going to notice that in every single word, every single descriptor, it starts with the word self. So it doesn't do any good if I have the skill and give it to, and tell them they have it. They have to possess it ultimately in order for it to be an effective skill. So self-regulation is how kids police themselves. What are the skills and the strategies that they use in order to maintain appropriate behavior and effective student performance? So the example I have over here is a cashier who stays polite and calm even when an angry customer is berating him for something he has no control over. Okay, that's an example of somebody who has terrific self-regulation skills. There's you'll see in teacher education, one of my presentation on that day happens to be around executive functioning, and self-regulation is a huge part of executive functioning. And in fact, here are the sub-skills that one has to actually master in order to be an effective self-regulator. And you'll notice the areas are attention, processing, memory, emotional modulation, and actual planning. And each of those categories have subset skills where if the kids break down, they cannot perform to their potential or optimally. So this is a whole other workshop. But I did want you to see that all these self-regulation skills are ones that, most kids in special education are not going to possess. In fact, they're going to have breakdowns pretty early. So in order to understand how to read this chart, you start from the left to the right, and as soon as a breakdown happens over here, it's probably going to impact everything else to the right of it, okay? And then the other one is you look at it vertically, so if they can't energize themselves enough to attend, then you're not even going to know if they can do the rest of these things, okay? So that's how you kind of look at the regulation skills. Don't go line by line, but you can go category by category, and then you can look down in the columns and see where the breakdown points are. We spend a lot of time on vocabulary and helping kids to understand what each of those skills are so that they can identify the breakdown points that they have and we can begin to work on them. Instead of being learning different or attentional deficit disordered, we can use these kind of words to mitigate the pathology behind it and help kids be able to focus on a particular skill that they can develop to mitigate the obstacles that they're encountering. All right, so in order to self-regulate, there are 4 basic components they have to do. They've got to set a standard. They've got to say, I need to be able to attend longer to the assignment that they have. They have to set a standard for that. If they're not motivated to do that, we're going to be stuck at square one, okay? And again, this is why we have to start with strength-based perceptions of themselves, because we have to convince themselves that even though attention is a problem for them, it is something that they can actually work on and mitigate its interference levels. So they have to be genuinely motivated to meet that standard. They've got to want to do better. And ironically, what we find when kids become vulnerable is they all want to do better than they've done before. As much of the defense mechanisms as we see at our school, they actually are, they want to do better. They just don't know how to do it, and they're scared to death that we're going to think of them negatively or critically as a person instead of a person with some challenges, okay? We're going to talk about self-monitoring just a little bit, and then they've got to possess the willpower, grit, and resiliency. And you'll see that to control their urges. And when I say urges, these are the avoidance strategies that they get into, or the negative attention-seeking behaviors that they've exhibited elsewhere. So they've got to have the willpower and grit to fight through that. And I just want to point this out. So in emotional modulation, this is where we're talking about having the grit and resiliency to tolerate frustration, persevere through challenge, understand where their emotional state is, and modulate their frustration or however they're feeling, to inhibit the desire to quit, to have cognitive flexibility, and then to make corrections in their behavior. So self-regulation actually deals a lot, and in fact primarily with the emotional realm, although you'll see in the right-hand planning, it actually has the study skills component as well. All right? So when you get self-regulated learners, they actually are more motivated to learn because they are actually in a mental state or an emotional state to learn. Once they understand how to modulate themselves, all those factors, they actually are more motivated to learn because they don't have so many interferences coming down on them. And then you can see the other skills that they will develop once they become self-regulated. So this is a critical aspect to motivation, to behavior, and to understanding themselves as somebody who has potential to be a learner. When they are able to exercise self-regulation, they realize something about themselves, and that is that the environment doesn't control them. They actually can manage and control the environment to some degree, and that is a really important differing of how they look at themselves and in the context of a school classroom. And no longer do they feel powerless and that you have all the power and all the choice making. They begin to see that they actually are able to make some choices and to empower themselves to take control and responsibility for their learning. And of course, once they realize that and they generalize those, especially the emotional self-regulation skills, they begin to look at themselves as being somebody who could be capable outside the classroom as well. And we look here particularly at the social realm, and for them to be able to develop and sustain friendships, as well as being an autonomous individual who can do things for themselves and not necessarily need other people to prompt them or to direct them to be able to do that. All right, this is kind of just a relief, quick relief on self-regulation. Notice the window on the principal, right? Oh, nice connotation they give me. All right. So how do we teach to elevate self-regulation? Okay, first of all, in the workshop, one of the things that I talk about is using the vocabulary that I showed you in that chart. There's beginning to use those words with the kids and being able to model when you are actually challenged or using one of those subtest skills so that they become used to hearing those kinds of words coming from teachers. Our kids tend to think that the adults, even though you feel like they think you're bad, is they think you're actually too perfect for them and you don't have any flaws. And so to have flaws or to have challenges in which you're actually working on areas of here gives them a sense that you have worked on some skills that they have to work on too, and that you've learned to manage them, and you have confidence that they're going to be able to do that as well. So a lot of what we do is we use these kind of words around youngsters to identify issues that we may have first, so that we're modeling our vulnerability and the challenges that we come to work through those problems, though, and not to work around them. Okay, we work to help kids develop a more positive vision, like how's the day going to go today? And what we want to hear from our kids is I'm going to be able to accomplish something. I'm going to have fun with my friends outside, and I'm going to also be able to finish a math assignment that I had trouble with yesterday. So we're trying to envision helping them see themselves as at the beginning of the day as having some accomplishments that they can attain, and then at the end of the day reflecting on that and saying, yes, I was able to do that, okay? Before they begin a multi-step task, we front load the issues that could pose a challenge and engage in actually a discussion of how are we going to work through that. So many of our kids really don't like to write. I have a lot of boys who really don't like writing at all. So one of the things we talk about is, okay, how are we going to get through this assignment together? Okay, so they'll come up with some ideas like, well, maybe if we talk about it beforehand, that'll give me some ideas. And maybe teachers can write some key vocabulary words on the board. So what they're doing is they're looking for assistance to work through some of the challenges they are anticipating they're going to face, instead of us having to react to when they say, I quit, I'm not going to do this, or the paper flies across the room. Again, if you went back to self-awareness, if we can get them to think and anticipate where some of those issues are going to arise and we resolve them beforehand, we're much less likely to have to be reactive and disciplinary when we're working through some of the challenges that are going to inevitably come from some assignments that we have to give them. We have to acknowledge the challenge of these particular emotions. These are very hard for kids to manage. And so we have discussion of strategies of how do you work through feeling embarrassed or disappointed or overwhelmed or confused or rejected or really frustrated. Because these are emotions that we know our kids are encountering. They're feeling them a lot and they don't know what to do with them. And they're pretty difficult for a lot of us adults to deal with. And so again, we have discussions around, yes, you will have these emotions. It's how we express them. How can we work through it so it doesn't become an obstacle for you? And then build in a plan including rewarding contingencies. I'm going to persevere for X number of minutes, and then I'm going to allow myself to take a 5-minute break. Okay? So that's how we do a lot of teaching to self-regulation in doing that. All right. So get with a partner. You've just rushed into class barely as the starting bell rings. The commute was terrible and it took you 20 minutes longer than usual, so now you have no time to get yourself emotionally or logistically ready for your first period class. You anticipated that you would have time to get the materials ready so you could plunge right into the lesson, because this class tends to be very rambunctious if you're not keeping them continually engaged. Okay? Teacher's nightmare, right? Okay, now what I want you to do is, how could you actually transform this potential nightmare into a really beneficial teaching opportunity, focusing on self-regulation skills? So get with a partner and talk about how could you do that? How could you take that sort of disaster situation and actually make it a beneficial teaching opportunity for your class? Okay. Any partners want to share how you took that disastrous scene and actually made it a beneficial self-regulation lesson? Anybody dare do it?
Of course. We'll do it.
Okay, good.
So one of the things I said is I think I'd come in and just admit it. Wow, this was not how I planned my morning to go. Can we all take a really big breath together? Because I need to calm my body down.
Great.
And then actually, Crystal had an even better entrance to the next thing, but you can give your part that we need to do next.
Part of the things that we sometimes do when we recognize we're about to enter the situation is have a little idea in mind, some sort of exercise that they can do. And the exercise that we talked about was actually for people to reflect on times this happened, but they happened beyond their control.
Love it. Love it. The other thing is, you could put a chart like this in front of them and say, how do you think I'm feeling right now? Because the other thing is that our kids actually become so self-focused on their own stuff that they actually don't think in the terms of context of other people. And you can help them do that by saying, how do you think I feel right now? Just take a guess. If I showed you that chart, what would you say I might be feeling right now? So I love two things that you said. One was the pronoun I. Okay, and as soon as you say I, you become a human being to them, okay? You're no longer the teacher, you're an I, you're a person, which is really important. And number two is, I heard at least one of the words up there on self-regulation skills. which is really excellent. It is important for kids to understand that emotions are a real thing, that they exist. We are way past the time when emotions are not allowed in a classroom, like back when I was a kid, and you were all to sit straight up in your chairs and have flat affect and just work and sort of swallow our emotions. That is not what we do in society today. But you have to know how to manage your emotions, okay? And that's the other thing you can talk about you coming in, because you're not going to come in and slam your papers down. Oh, that's stupid. Oh, the commute was just horrible, and profanities flying out of your mouth. You're not going to do that, right? You have demonstrated self-regulation. Get the kids to understand. How did you regulate? Or to explain to them, what am I doing to take care of myself right now? Because I am frustrated, and I'm dead to equilibrium, and I don't feel great, and I'm not prepared to start this lesson. But look, I'm trying really hard to manage myself. And what am I doing? And you see, on the self-awareness, if you know exactly the strategies that you are using, you're going to be able to describe it really well to them. And I can tell you the kids will listen way harder to that self-regulation lesson than the curriculum lesson you probably have planned, because it's real. It's real to them. All right, good. So let's move on to stage 3. So this is self-monitoring. Self-monitoring is a concept you probably both know, all pretty much know it, in the 70s by Mark Snyder. And it shows how people assess their self-presentation, or how are they presenting themselves, how are they behaving. Obviously, in order to self-monitor, you have to be aware of what you are, of how you present yourself. And you are in a constant sense of evaluating how you're doing. So in order to do this, if you've got a flaw or a challenge, you've obviously had to acquire at this point an optional strategy or behavior that has either been taught by you or guided or developed by the youngster and has been practiced. Okay, so that they're at the point where you are going to now be able to back off of the external prompting and ask that youngster to begin to self-evaluate and self-monitor how they're putting into practice the alternative behavior or the strategies that they've been practicing or that they've acquired. Now, interestingly, the self-monitoring is very much associated with social characteristics and attributes. And I kind of want to just talk about this bottom part of this slide just for a second, because it's going to articulate for you a little bit of the difference in the kids you're going to see. So high self-monitors, which are kids usually not in special education, are very aware of the social context they're in. They really intuitively understand when people are listening to them and engaging with them, and they are motivated to have people engaged with them. And they'll use all kinds of good strategies, positive strategies like active listening, questioning, paraphrasing, all of that good kind of stuff, because they are constantly evaluating your engagement with them. Okay, so these are people who are highly social, they're popular, they have good friendships, they sustain those friendships really well. They're very cognizant of how other people perceive them. And then you have the lower social monitors. So these are people who are very principle-based. They have a set of beliefs, they have a set of principles, they have a set of standards that they set for, and they are more important than whether you agree or disagree with them. And so they're less concerned about whether they're popular, whether you're engaging with them, whether they're pleasing you in their conversation, because they are principle-based. Here's my concern. I think we take these high principle kids who oftentimes are a little bit inflexible about listening to alternative perspectives, but we put a label on them called high-functioning autistic. But there are kids who have a set of principles that they actually firmly believe in. And they've either been taught in the family, or it's something that's come up, or it's through their experiences, but they're not as motivated to engage you in terms of having a reciprocal discussion. These are youngsters who actually, if you don't agree with them, they actually go, okay, you don't have to, and they may leave. They may just cut the conversation off. We see this with kids who are very invested in video games. It's true. They are very principle-based about how or what games they play, or how, the scores they're going to get, or whatever that is. And if you don't agree with it or you're not interested, they don't care. They're going to go find somebody else who's interested in it. Okay, that's a low social monitor. So their self-monitoring is going to look very different than the high social, the kids who really want to have a lot of friends and want to be able to please them and lack maybe some of the more advanced kind of social skills that would allow them to gain that. So I just want to bring that up just because it's true, and we can't make everybody charismatic and really socially astute. Okay, so in order to be an effective self-monitor, we have to have the kids be able to identify a targeted, specific, and measurable behavior that they were not able to do very well before, that has been taught, or a coping strategy that's been taught to them and practiced under your guidance or under the guidance of several adults. So the student can perform that task or that behavior with now only minimal prompting from you. Okay? So now it's time for them to be able to take responsibility or charge of whatever that new behavior is. Okay? And the purpose is for that youngster to for us to help them intrinsically be able to monitor and evaluate that new behavior that they've acquired, so that you are no longer controlling or overseeing the change in that behavior. Okay? So this is not something you do at the outset, but it's a very important part to cement youngsters who have had to make some behavioral changes or academic strategy changes. The ultimate goal, of course, being to ultimately fade out the whole self-monitoring and having the youngster actually acquire that as part of their behavioral or work performance. Do it. So here's some examples. There are checklists where you ask the youngster, did I? There are rating scales, how well did I do something? And then frequency check-ins, like beeper reminders if on their watch, or something that buzzes or reminds them to, recalls them to do something. And we'll also, I'll also show you some front-loading reminders. So here's some examples. This is a sample checklist. This is a youngster who's working on having good table manners, and the checklist that they have. Okay, here's a kind of a rating scale. So they're earning certain numbers of pennies depending upon their quality or how well they're performing on the skill, how well they've behaved, or whatever. You can see the measurable: raise my hand, follow directions the first time, work with my teammates, and then they're giving themselves X number of pennies as they earn pennies, and then they lose pennies by shouting out. So you can see it's not all or nothing. It's not yes or no. An example of a front-loading reminder is I go to school every day to learn. When I'm in class, my teacher has rules that I need to follow, and these are things that would be front-loaded with the youngster. That typically, we would be front-loading with the youngster, but what you want to do now is give them that reminder so that they are front-loading themselves, and you no longer have to play a prominent role in this. Okay? So how about, here's another activity. So with a partner, describe how you consciously self-monitor a personal weakness or a challenge. Now I don't mean to get really sensitive here, okay? So let me give you the example, all right? So if you waken yourself to an alarm clock, because otherwise you might sleep too late, you've actually put a self-monitoring device in it. Because I'm assuming nobody in here waits for their mother to come in and wake them up, right? I mean, you don't do that anymore. So an alarm clock is actually a self-monitoring device. So why don't you, again, get with your partner and think of something that actually you do or you use that monitors a behavior that you might not otherwise be able to perform automatically. Okay, do that. And then we're not going to do the other ones, but there probably are more opportunities than you've thought of for kids to actually start self-monitoring on particularly behaviors or learning strategies that you've been talking to them. And if you think about this and reflect on it, you're still prompting them, when in fact what you want to do is switch them into self-monitoring it. okay? But do the partner and just use something like the alarm clock and just take one example of something that you have actually realized right now. You have an instrument that monitors what you do instead of having your mother or your spouse or somebody else prompt you to do it, okay? Okay. So besides the buzzing watches, what other self-monitoring instruments did you all realize you're using? I heard a great one up here in front, but I'm not going to tell you I heard it. Yes, go ahead.
I'm very forgetful, so I tend to put everything down on a list.
There you
It
go.
drives me crazy.
And nobody tells you have to do that, right? You've learned how to do that yourself. So you are self-monitoring that because you know you have a challenge in remembering things and keeping everything straight. Great, great example. Anything else? Yep.
Like your Fitbit or your little health monitor on your phone, you're monitoring how much activity you have. You're checking it. I have a box month. I need to be more active today.
Super. Great. Anything else? All right, so what I want you to think about after you leave here, one of the things to take and reflect on is what are the skills that you're prompting your kids on that you found that you actually realize you prompted on them for months, and we really want to change it to self-monitoring, and could you figure out a way to have them be in control of whatever that prompting behavior that you're working on, okay? When you do that, you are helping kids become healthier because the healthiest adults feel competent, they feel relational, and they feel autonomous, and when you self-monitor, you are facilitating their ability to be autonomous, okay? So that's really an important skill. All right, we're going to move on and go to stage 4, which is self-reinforcement, which is really interesting because I think we make lots of mistakes in education on this, and I think this actually impedes kids' ability to go to stage 5 and 6. So self-reinforcement is the process whereby the individuals feel competent enough and autonomous enough to be able to self-congratulate or to congratulate themselves when they have met the standard that they've set and not require you to do that. Now, I'm not saying this is an all or nothing thing, but in special education, for those of you in special education, you know how much we praise and support and give positive feedback to, and we do it a lot because kids have low self-esteem. The problem is that the kids never learn how to self-reinforce, and so they continue to rely on other people validating them, which is not going to be possible as they go through high school, college, and into their adulthood. That's not going to happen, okay? And so when we fail to help kids learn to self-reinforce, they remain dependent on positive extrinsic feedback in order to move to the next step, or in order to take the next risk, or to take on the next challenge, because if they haven't been validated, they retreat back into their safe zones. Okay? So obviously, the previous steps are all important that they've done that, but they then need to be able to say, hey, you know what? I worked through that challenge, and I feel great about it. And not necessarily depend on you as the teacher say, it was such a good job that you worked through that challenge. Okay? It's a gradual drawback, but there are strategies that you can use to help kids to self-reinforce. Okay? Incidentally, I just want to say that when kids can't self-reinforce, they probably are not intrinsically feeling very good about themselves yet. Okay? So when we started talking about what we do at the end of the day at EBC, we are actually, I'm not interested in them telling me. I'm interested in them articulating those accomplishments for their own benefit. Because I'm not telling them what they did do well. They are describing. That is self-reinforcement. I was able to do, and I overcame this challenge. We're having them do it out loud, and eventually they'll move it into their inner voice, but they've got to start by actually doing it. So how do you get kids to do that? Okay, one way, well, we're going to skip direct reinforcement. Vicariously, we want kids to be able to observe that they did something just as well as everybody else. That's called vicarious reinforcement. And so when they are reinforcing themselves, if they're doing peer tutoring or they're working as a group, they can self-reinforce by saying, I was able to work really well with this group. Instead of you having to say, boy, Tommy, you work really well with that group. Okay, that's vicarious. Like they take it in and they go, I played a part in my group project. So that's vicarious self-reinforcement, and then self-reinforcement is done in it's done in a really easy way. So you hand back the assignment that the youngster has, you know that youngster, you're feeling pretty confident that youngster has felt good about the accomplishment they have, right? So you hand it back to them, and instead of making a statement, you ask a question. How do you feel about that? Now, the response is going to give you a very authentic look at how they actually feel about themselves and how far they've come in terms of self-reinforcement. Well, I could have done better. You're handing a kid an 89 who's never gotten that before. They've only gotten 75s. You hand them the 89 and they go, I should have got a 90. Okay, they're not really ready to reinforce themselves. So you have to ask a question. Do you realize that this is 14 points better than you ever did before? Okay, instead of saying you did a good job. Okay, that is the still dependency on the extrinsic reinforcement, and what we're trying to do here is get kids to feel good, genuinely positive about accomplishments that they actually have made in the classroom. So questions are much more effective in terms of facilitating self-reinforcement than you making the statement. Now, you may ultimately have to make the statement at the early onset because they're not used to doing that. But asking them the question, how do you feel about what you accomplished here, is a really important step to helping kids be able to self-reinforce. Then, and this is what you'd like to be working toward, you can validate and confirm their own perception of that when they congratulate themselves. Now you are affirming not the accomplishment, the statement of self-reinforcement. That's what they need, and that's what they need reinforcement on. Okay, that's what you reinforce the reinforcement. Okay, everybody understand the difference? Instead of reinforcing the task or the accomplishment in the task, you're going to reinforce themselves self-reinforcing. You're going to validate that they have a positive, that is the correct perception, and they deserve to feel that sense of accomplishment. All right, so another activity. I told you this is going to be highly engaging. Okay, so Mary's just received an A- on her unit algebra test. In the past, Mary's had little confidence that she would ever be able to master the formulas for solving quadratic equations, but in this test, after studying hard the night before and by practicing them aloud with her friend, Mary got a 92. How can you use this situation to build Mary's self-reinforcement, and what would be a comment that Mary might make that would indicate she is yet unable to really self-reinforce and still relies on others to reinforce her? So why don't you work with your partner again just for a couple of minutes on that? How could you instill the opportunity to self-reinforce for Mary on her algebra test? So let's start with anybody. If you heard a comment saying that Mary was unable to be self-reinforcing yet, anybody? What would be a typical comment that she might make?
Tina really was the one who got me to do this.
Yeah, somebody else was responsible. That's a good one. Tina was. I wouldn't have done it if Tina hadn't helped me. What else?
It was only because this test was easier than the other.
Right. Okay. Rational. See how the rationalizations are negative. Okay, and that means the youngster still doesn't believe in themselves. See how extrinsic was? The test and my friend were responsible for my success. See how extrinsic that is? Okay, there's no role that I played in that. So those are very good examples of a kid who's not quite ready to self-reinforce because they see everything, even the positives that happen to her coming from the outside in. Okay, not coming from within. Okay, so that's a good clue. So I had a question about using the word should. You should feel proud about this. Okay, that's a problem, folks. Should's a judgmental. Should is a judgmental word. It's a very judgmental word, And it puts you into a position where you are judging the other person. You should feel this. You should be doing this. You should, and that immediately puts up a defense barrier for those youngsters and doesn't make them feel comfortable. Shoulds can be easily transferred into, I'm going to help you get to the standard that we're trying to achieve. I'm going to help you get to the standard you want to go. Okay? Because if you really think about it, if the kids should feel proud and they don't feel proud, it is that they can't feel proud at that point in the moment. Okay? That's one of these can't versus won'ts. So when we use the word should, we are assuming the youngster has the skill and is choosing not to use it. And that is very seldom true. Okay? So avoid the word should. All right. So without getting specific, what would be the key to get married to self-reinforce here? What would be the key thing you would do?
I am proud of you.
Nope.
How do you think you feel about
Okay, so what did you do? So how's that different from this? What's different about your statement as opposed to, well, actually, I shouldn't say statement. What's your comment versus her comment? What's the difference?
you?
One. What's the other one? Statement, question. Statement, there's no response. You've already told me what I'm going to feel now, right? Question, emanating from the kid. It emanates now from the kid, and that's what you want. The question makes them say what they feel and gives you the barometer. The statement imposes your domain on the youngster. Now, you may need to do that in order to validate the accomplishment when kids aren't ready to be able to do that. But you want to give the youngster an opportunity to actually express how they're feeling. That's a great barometer for you in terms of how they're developing this ability to be self-reinforcing. All right.
Do some kids just come in with an overinflated self?
Yep, they sure do.
Because I feel like I've run into quite a few of those. How do you help them
Yeah,
regulate?
regulate.
That's actually.
Yeah, this to go all the way to, okay, go all the way back to self-awareness, right? Yes, yeah. They're self-aware, and usually youngsters who are not going there at all are just afraid of, they're terrified of being vulnerable, and the things that are blockages for them are terrifying. When kids get defensive, you can almost guarantee that they're fear-based. As much as they don't look that way, they are very much fear-based. Externalizing it places blame and projects the problem outside of themselves. And so when you first try to increase self-awareness, you're asking kids to become vulnerable. And initially, they feel very powerless to do that because they don't know what to do with it. But it is absolutely essential in the evolution of getting kids to change behaviors and perceptions of themselves that they start using the pronoun I. And that they start talking about not only their strengths and aptitudes, but specific challenges that they've hit, that they want to overcome. Sometimes to start with, they may be completely trivial, but it's a start. And if they resolve this one up here, then they're willing to go a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper and then a little bit deeper. All right, self-efficacy. This was huge when I was growing up. It's a belief, it's the person's belief that they're going to be able to work through a challenge successfully. It's an innate belief that regardless of what you put in front of them, they're going to figure out how to get through it. Okay? And this happens, we ask these kids in school all the time to get through things that they don't feel innately confident or competent in doing. So part of what you have to do in self-advocacy is they have to develop a belief system that they are going to actually be able to work through challenges that arise in school. Okay, now, it may require that they ask for assistance in it, but the point of the matter is they are going to ask the assistance in order to get through to the end point that they want to reach or that you want them to reach. And that belief system is you're going to be able to help them to be able to do that. That's very different from you're going to make me do it. Okay, how that's outside, you make me do it. I think I can use you to help me get through it. Okay, and that belief system of doing that. So people who have so low senses of efficacy, and we see this all the time in special ed, they withdraw, they shy away from difficult tasks, which they perceive as personal threats to their integrity. Okay, not just to their performance as a student, to their personal integrity. So they have low aspirations and weak commitments so that they are always in the safe zone. And if somebody pushes them beyond that safety zone or that secure zone, that's your problem. It becomes you have asked too much. You have made it impossible for me to be successful. So the idea here is that it reflects a confidence that regardless of what you put in front of them, they're going to be able to figure out how to work through to completion or to some kind of resolution on the task that you're giving them. So this is what it looks like in visual form. This little guy is absolutely, you can just see the confidence, like he's going to strike this guy right out, okay? He just believes it. Now, whether he does or not is a whole other question, but self-efficacy is the belief that you're going to be up there doing it. And I have another baseball example here. So a baseball player with high efficacy believes he or she is going to get a hit every time they go to the plate, even though good baseball players get hits 3 out of 10 times and they get out 7. But every time they go up, they believe they're going to get a hit. The person with low efficacy goes up to the plate hoping not to strike out. Do you see the difference? Our kids go up to the plate hoping they don't strike out. And what we need to do in order to help them get to self-advocacy is bring them into self-efficacy and the belief that they are going to be able to be successful. It's an innate belief. You can't do it for them. They have to believe it. It's a belief system. So this gets into the social, a social learning and cognitive theory that I want to just take a second on, because you take a huge role, you actually as teachers take a huge role in facilitating this. It's key to strengthening self-reinforcement, and it develops this look at the world as opposed to being controlled by adults over them, that they can manage their own environments. Okay, so there are 4 factors that go into this. It's the actual experience of being successful and having accomplishments in performances or tasks that they have undertaken. They have seen, and they have actually seen from an objective viewpoint or perception, others who are successful and they doing comparable work. Okay, so they look around, and you know kids do this all the time. They look around and they begin to see that I'm doing things as well as Billy, Ann, Frank, and Johnny. Okay, that's called vicarious. And they're getting intrinsically reinforced by the fact that they actually can now objectively see that they are doing as well as those people who they have identified as being successful people. You've given them verbal encouragement. People have extrinsically reinforced them. Okay, and then finally that their emotional state, that they've learned to modulate and to regulate their emotions so that they are available for feedback and input and learning and directives. So when that happens, these all go together to develop that intrinsic belief system that they are going to be successful. They can be successful in something they didn't think they could do, and it's reflected in their behavior and their performance in class. Okay, so those 4 components are essential to helping them get to that point of being having self-efficacy. I'm going to go past that. So here's how the belief system gets formed, and it's as simple as ABC. There's always going to be an activating event. There's going to be a belief about that outcome, and it's going to create a consequence. Now, in the positive, the belief about the outcome becomes positive. The problem we run into is the activating event, sometimes, more often than not in the past, has stimulated a negative belief about the outcome, and in fact is a self-fulfilling prophecy in which the consequence actually fulfills that belief, where kids fail. See, and this is why we're trying to change the whole thing. That belief system is going to be very key. So here's an example of the ABC in the negative. Jeannie, who's age 16, holds a 3.8 GPA in all subjects but math, and she has a final exam in Algebra 2 tomorrow. Though she has worked hard on her assignments in this unit, her average is only a 74. Okay, that's the activating event. There's the test tomorrow. Jeannie's belief. I just know I'm not going to do well on this test. It doesn't matter how hard I work. This isn't going to go well for me. Okay, that's her belief. And so what does she do? Jeannie quits studying early that evening and watches TV until midnight. The next day in the exam, she gets a 76 and says to her mother, see, I told you this was going to happen. But do you see how she created consequences that led to fulfilling the belief? Now, I think what I do is I think I wanted you to see if you could change that ABC to something that would have a positive outcome. What would that look like? Have the same activating event, but with your partner, create a different B, and therefore you will get a different C. Okay? Everybody understand? So this is, the belief here is negative. So what I want you to do with the partner is create the inner talk that would say, I am going to. All right? And then what would be the consequence of that? For Jeannie. Yeah, for Jeannie, okay? Just take a couple of seconds. It should be really pretty quick, and then we'll get to the last stage. Okay, so we don't run over. I'm gonna hasten us a little bit here. So here's how you can ascertain the level of self-efficacy. When you create an event, which you do all the time as teachers, okay, you may want to get kids to articulate. You may want to take a youngster that you're concerned about after class and ask them, what do you think is going to happen tomorrow? What do you think is going to happen when you take the exam? And you will get everything you need to know about how that kid's feeling about it and probably what's going to happen the next day. Okay? And again, the more negative this is, the less ready they are to do self-advocacy. These are all prerequisite skills. In order to be an effective self-advocate, you have to believe that you are capable of being an accomplishing, productive student. Otherwise, you're not going to do, you're going to ask people to help you, and they get to 18 and then nobody's ready to help you unless you're going to seek it out. And this is what our kids don't understand. They don't understand that when they reach 18, it all changes. And this is why self-advocacy is very important. But the prerequisites to get them to self-advocacy are equally as important, because if they can't advocate by themselves by 18, they're going to be stuck. They won't be able to seek out the support they need, and they won't have a self-perception that they can accomplish anything on their own. Which leads me to, very quickly on this, so it's important for everybody to understand about self-determination theory. If you have not been at all exposed to it, it's really very important, because it identifies the three components of being a healthy adult, or actually a healthy adolescent for that. Okay, you need to feel and believe that you are competent and that you can manage your environment and the tasks that are asked of you. You need to be able to feel that you are capable and can be successful in sustaining close and long-term relationships. And you need to be able to believe and feel like you can be autonomous, that you can do lots of things independently, and that you know who and when and where to go when you need support. That defines the healthy adult. Okay? And so our job as teachers is to accentuate or facilitate to the best of our ability youngsters' belief that they can be competent, their belief that they can be relational, and a belief, and an intrinsic and innate belief that they can be autonomous in doing so. So, and these are all the specific skills that go into being self-determined. How do you make choices? How do you solve problems? How do you make decisions? Understanding that decisions and choices have consequences, and understanding what those are going to be. And then the rest of it is what we've begun to talk about. To get to self-determination, notice that the skills are self-awareness, self-regulation, self-reinforcement, and self-efficacy. Okay? This is in child's language, starting from the bottom. I won't do it, which, like I said, masks I can't do it. And you'll see that's the next step. I can't. This is totally defensive. This opens up vulnerability, and when you get vulnerability, you get teachability, okay? And then you work your way all the way up that. That's self-determination, and then in kids' language. All right, the final stage is self-advocacy. So self-advocacy is simply putting all of these prerequisite skills together to be able to autonomously listen, ask, and speak in order to problem solve in a way that helps one realize their optimal level of competency and their relational potential. That's what it is. The ability to ask and the ability to speak. So you can't ask and you can't speak if you don't understand all of these other prerequisite skills. I think self-advocacy sometimes can be way oversimplified, and it requires these prerequisite skills in order for kids to sit in a room where there are adults and people who believe they are experts and know better than the youngster knows about who they should be and what they should be doing. And an advocate has to believe in their own abilities, be able to ascertain their strengths and weaknesses and articulate them for a group of, quote, expert professionals in order to get what they need. I don't know if you've ever, I've been in plenty of IEPs, and when I say, well, this kid needs a Chromebook with a lot of software loaded in, if the district doesn't have a lot of resources, they have no problem saying to me, sorry, we won't be able to do that. When the youngster says, in order for me to achieve my goals, I'm going to need a Chromebook with some software applied because I have this issue of spell checking and that kind of organizing my writing, do you actually think an adult's going to say, no, you can't? That does not happen. But kids have to be able to understand what they need, what they can do. They have to know themselves, they have to know what they need, and they need to know how to get it. So we'll take one of these. We're going to just choose one. There are three. With a partner, I want you to share how you would respond or act to the following. And this is where self-advocacy comes in. And you can actually measure your own ability to be self-advocate and your belief system in yourself. And what would you do in some of these situations? Actually, instead of doing it with a partner, just read the scenarios and think to yourself, what would you do? How would you advocate for yourself in those particular situations? So in order to advocate for yourself in those three situations, if you think back on what we've covered, you will see that you have to have all of those other skills in place. You can't just respond to that. Now you may respond to it and not have thought about it in the way that we've gone over it this afternoon, because we as adults, especially those of us who are lucky enough to be in education in this field, actually were able to go through this cycle that I showed you at the beginning intuitively. The kids we're dealing with are not going to be able to do that. They're going to have to be taken and taught through each of the steps in the cycle. So teaching self-advocacy skills requires mastery of several prerequisites. Okay? First, we've got to develop a positive but realistic perception of our aspirations, interests, aptitudes, and attributes, as well as acknowledge that we have challenges and weaknesses. Then we must master essential self-regulation skills that will ultimately facilitate or inhibit us from being successful in completing tasks and attaining personal goals. Increasingly, we must do this autonomously, thus the need to self-monitor and self-reinforce to transform from a person dependent on extrinsic factors, people, things, and rationalizing that to feeling a greater sense of intrinsic control over our environment. Next, we have to genuinely believe in an I can attitude. I can get through this. Using self-determination theory, I can be relational. I believe I can be competent, and I believe I can be autonomous, and then and only then are kids going to be able to stand up and be able to self-advocate. Okay? Thank you very much. I hope this was beneficial to you. This is not actually really taught very much, and It's something that we've developed at EBC School after many years, and you can probably tell I've been around for a long time. But we have found increasing success, and we are fortunate enough to do it in an environment where we have behavior specialists, therapists, and special educators who know this, and we integrate those our services that way, so kids are getting this constant message from all those different domains and putting it together. And I can tell you that it has been largely, I'm not going to say wholly, but largely successful, and we are getting the majority of our kids back into less restrictive settings. So, and this is a key part of it.